So, the motion for the first ever Finger Lakes Cup is as follows. In jurisdictions that have capital punishment, this House would televise executions. In jurisdictions that have capital punishment, this House would televise executions. 15 minutes from now, the debate will begin. Now that everyone's back on stage, I'm going to introduce the debaters. We have from Colgate, we have Cameron Patrick and Benjamin Dokupil.
Good enough.
Sorry.
I understand.
And from Rochester, we have Madeline Fordham and Charles Unlovu. And from Cornell University, we have Amar Hayasati. I'm trying. And Dylan Young. And from HWS, we have Sreyan Kanungo and Sarim Karim. Okay, with that said, I am very happy to call this debate to order. I will be calling up speakers from my chair, and when you are speaking, you are free not to wear your mask. House to order. I recognize the Honorable Prime Minister, and I invite him to open the debate.
Good evening. Confirm you can hear me clearly. For pure eyes, I'll be taking them in the tech space. Okay. So it's your boy Charles. Big shout out to my coaches, to RPDA, and to all that have supported me. So I would like to start this speech. I'll be starting in 3, 2, 1. Panel, understand the importance of today's debate in how it shapes the trajectory of society, but also criminal justice. We think that fundamentally, capital punishment is like death, like to individuals that we believe that have harmed society in a way that is unforgivable. But then secondly, we think that when you say televised, you're looking at like reality TV or news programs and so forth, right? We think that is not like today's debate, what it should be about. So then, we think then like in terms of like burdens, we have to show you why in terms of the trajectory of society, why it is better off in a world whereby we televise these executions, right? And why like get pragmatic outcomes from that, what I said, right? So therefore, we think that we're going to rubbish at this very moment, like sort of like low-level pure eyes about like how traumatic this would be to say, well, there is an opt-in, opt-out mechanism, just in the same way you have an opt-in, opt-out mechanism for like action films and all these like highly violent films, right? We think that if you feel like uncomfortable, you are not forced to watch these things anyways, right? So I think this is something that is actually true, right? And also like on the idea like how people didn't cheer on these executions, two responses to this one. We tell you that like this is a small number of percentage of people if we consider to that point, but then secondly, even at the point at which they actually do, right, we think that like people would do it anyways without televisation, just like the way like people celebrated the death of Bin Laden without necessarily seeing a video of him dying, right? So we don't necessarily think that it's something that would be exclusive to our side. Hence, we do not expect any sort of argumentation on that regard from like the sort of like opposition teams. So therefore, in terms of what you hear from me today, you hear like three things. One is on the ideas of like how society tries to hide and sanitize the worst parts of itself and why that on its own is something that is bad. But then secondly, you hear on like how like pragmatically by so doing we lower the executions comparatively more than what their side does, right? But then thirdly, you hear like how like we get like more people involved in the criminal justice system as it is, right? So therefore, to my matter. So panel, understand that society has a tendency to hide and sanitize itself, the worst of itself, right? We think that like society should be able to stand and be willing to stand for its actions and for its sins, right? For true justice. Meaning to say, we think that in the vast majority of instances, what usually happens is that like the people that like actually have harmed other individuals and how they are dealt with is something that you do not know, right? Wait, it's something that you do not know, right? We think this is something that is bad. Why? Because we have swept all these crimes and like punishments under the rug, right? But then more so we have saved like the punishment to them under the rug, right? We think that this is something that is bad, primarily for one reason. One, because these instances usually lack oversight, meaning to say there is like that sort of like cushion of accountability whereby you cannot hold these individuals accountable as society because you don't necessarily know what then happened with them. Notice how then opposition can come and say, but those records are free for public disclosure, right? We say no. We think that once they might be free, right? Because like it's hard for you to get them in any given instance, right? We think there's no incentive from you to go out of your way to find them. We think something that is bad. Okay, I'll take you.
If there is an opt-in, opt-out mechanism, that means that a lot of people who are disgusted by this won't see it anyway and your oversight doesn't exist.
Panel, we think that when movements such as the Black Lives Matter, right, try to say, watch that execution of a black man that happened yesterday, right, we think that even if you're going to opt out of watching it, right, because you're a supporter of the Black Lives Matter movement, there is more of an incentive from you because it has been like vouched for by someone that you trust. So I think that like you still get like the sort of like oversight check, right? But then second, it's on the idea about how we humanize these criminals. Panel, I for one like hate crime, right? I hate because I've been a victim of it. However, at a point in time at which we deal with these criminals, we think that they deserve justice on the very nature that they are humans too, right? We think in the vast majority of instances, people tend to neglect that and like they deal with humans in the vast like majority like of like they deal with them like in executions that are actually painful, right? We think that the idea that has stemmed is that, well, the galatine or all these other painful means have been eradicated. Now we have this like sort of like injection that is not painful, right? We think that at a particular point in time where you can watch on your television and see someone shaking for their life, we think that you can now see how human they are, right? In as much as they are criminal, right? They still deserve some human dignity attached to them. We think this is something that you primarily get at a point at which you can televise these people and you can see them, right? But then it's on the ideas of about how we lower these executions. Why? We think that once the government sees that for every execution that they do, right, they have to air it on television. We think there's less of an incentive from the judges themselves or from like all the other criminal enforcement to actually execute these individuals. Why? Because they know that at a particular point in time they've opened a chat. People are now going to be asking questions like, did this person deserve to die, right? Did this person deserve to die in this way, right? Was this like sort of like, was it a fair system and all of that? We think this is an incentive that you only get at a point that you televise. Notice how, even in the status quo, once the records are available, right? We think there are ways like of bureaucratic processes for you to like limit the amount of access that people have to these files anyways, right? So I think this is something that you only get on our side of the house. Now, why is this good, right? For two reasons. Why? We think that in the status quo, there's already a large chunk of wrongful executions, right? To say that, okay, whilst you might execute people for the crimes that they deserve, right? What about instances for those crimes where they did not deserve? We think that we owe an obligation to these people. Why? Because they did not commit that crime, right? We think this is something that is important, right? Which is why we like lowering executions is something that is important, right? But then secondly, we think that in the vast majority of instances, the criminal justice is in such a way that it is racially discriminating. Meaning to say, in the vast majority of instances, people that get like capital punishment are people of color, right? Meaning to say now, because now we have lowered like the sort of like executions because the government is now more accountable, we think that like we are actually dealing with this problem. Now, notice the comparative here, panel. In our side of the house, we're not saying that we're going to lower them by like huge margins, right? However, it's to say, on our side, we comparatively lower them more than their side does, right? This is something that is valuable. Now, to my third point, we make people more involved, right? One, we think that people have the right to knowledge, right? Like about like what's happening in the trajectory that their society is going to, right? That's the first line. But then secondly, we tell you that we open up the chat. Panel, understand that at a particular point in time, at which like right now, the Ukraine crisis is televisionized, right? And you can see the videos of the horrific things that Russia is doing. We think it has opened a chat for people who otherwise would not have cared to care about the Ukraine crisis. Meaning to say, now because we televise the execution of someone, right? That means that we open the chat, right? Chats like, did this person deserve to die? Did they deserve to die in this way, right? What did they do, right? Like, who was the judge? What was the verdict and all of that thing, right? We think that is only possible at a point at which it is televisionized, right? Notice how on the comparative, when you do not put it on television, what happens is that it can be swept under the rug. And for anyone looking for that crime, right, we can hit them by the bureaucratic process. So proud to win from OG.
I thank that speaker for those remarks. I would like to request all people who are not currently speaking to put their masks on, and all people in the audience, of course, as well. Thank that speaker for those remarks. Now, this House is pleased to recognize the leader of the opposition. Hear, hear.
Hello. Okay, cool. Okay, time starts in 3, 2, 1. Panel, any form of capital punishment is one that we think is principally unjust, but in a world in which you cannot prove to me that there's any benefit that comes from killing people, airing it on TV for millions to see and be traumatized by is, I think, an unjustifiable harm that comes from side government. I'm going to do a few things. One, set up where we think this is most likely to take place and why we think it's specifically problematic in states that are insecure, that use the televisation of capital punishment as a means of threatening their population to instill fear as a means of control. Secondly, I'm going to talk to you about the social costs of this, mainly through trauma, desensitization, and martyrdom. And finally, I'm going to talk to you about why deterrence doesn't work. I might flip that order halfway through. All right, set up first. I think that it's clear that this is a glorification of violence, i.e. televising something is a means of, one, getting the media to talk about it, but even if the media doesn't talk about it, you get the public to talk about it. And secondly, it's a means of power, right? That's to say that it's not about justice or ethics, because the justice has been meted out when that person has been given that punishment. What you're adding is an extra layer of impact here, which is to say everyone else must now watch that person die. I think that's necessarily bad. I think the instances in which this is likely to happen is places where states are insecure and they need a way to keep their population servile. This either looks like authoritarian states or insecure jurisdictions that need ways in which to curb people from speaking out against that state. It's a display of power to rule through fear. We think that's principally unjustified insofar as capital punishment just does not work. I'll analyze that later. But just quickly to touch on what side government has given us. They give us two arguments. Firstly, on the trajectory of society changing. One, I think if you can opt out of watching that televisation happen, you lose the impact of that argument if people don't want to watch it. But secondly, people's trauma is not a means to create change, i.e. activism against capital punishment already exists throughout the Western world and much of the developing world too. The mere existence of that punishment is enough of a reason to force for change, and you never proved me why this is the tipping point that's going to cause judges and individual people to want to change that. Weigh this and compare this against the argumentation that I bring forth to you now. Before that, I'll let CG respond.
So why does the average person want to watch someone be executed on television?
I don't think that the average person does want to watch the person be executed on television. If you want to tell me that like the existence of that is what's going to create that change, you have to prove to me that it's okay for all those who stumble upon it or know that it's happening to be traumatized. It's okay as a means of developing some greater change when change already exists. All right, first argument, social costs. Recognize that people just don't need to see this, right? Like, even if you can opt out of it, people still talk about it. There are probably going to be pundits on Fox News or wherever talking about this thing happening, and you just generate just the symbolic existence of like this television show about someone dying is enough to generate some level of exposure to that trauma. I think there's three layers of impact here. Firstly, families of the victim, i.e. the person that the criminal hurt or whatever, are likely to face double harm insofar as they've already witnessed or at least been exposed to the death of like their loved one, now have to also be further exposed to the discourse that surrounds the death of the person. Oftentimes recognize that families are often against capital punishment because they feel an extra form of guilt when they recognize that they're now responsible for violence meted out to someone else because violence was meted out to someone that they knew. But secondarily, the criminal's family is also doubly harmed in this instance because not only do they have to go through the trauma of watching their person go through trial, be publicly scrutinized, and then have to face the death penalty, but they now have to know that that penalty is being used as a form of national television. But thirdly, I think we have to recognize one very important thing, which is that people from ethnic and racial minority backgrounds are often the ones who are most likely to end up in the prison system, and often also most likely the ones to face the miscarriage of justice that side government is underlying all of their argumentation on. Recognize that what you do when you televise their death is you further normalize and spread out the violence violence that exists against BIPOC and and minority backgrounds, and you popularize that violence against them. If you want to talk to me about trauma, this is the way in which Black death becomes further normalized and becomes further as a means of traumatizing individuals. This likely means that like all the activism you talk about probably gets further numbed or dies down at the point in which these people now have to live with the idea of this fear over their head, knowing that like they are more and more exposed to a violent authoritarian state that's willing to use their bodies and their deaths as a means of keeping other people subservient. I think once again that's principally unjustified, and you further the harm that those populations uniquely face insofar as they're already overexposed and overly proximate to that violence. Secondly, on desensitization, sure.
Okay, when you televise the murder of black people, we think that you give the Black Lives Matter ammunition against criminal justice system. This is a good on our side of the house.
Okay, one, prove to me why the already existing instances of this being the highest year of police brutality that has ever existed in American history is not already enough for Black Lives Matter to have enough movement. But secondarily, why do we need to further show people the death of colored bodies as a means of creating change? All you're doing in that instance is instrumentalizing those people's deaths and also further traumatizing those who are close to that individual, whether it be by their racial compatibility or because they knew them, right? I don't think that trauma is something you prove to me insofar as other means for change exist. All right, desensitization. Recognize that we're already a society that is overexposed to violence, specifically violence against bodies of color. Recognize that in a world in which you publicly televise these deaths, you overexpose people to violence, and you also create the narrative that these criminals deserve this death, and not only do they deserve this death, but it's a death that should be glorified and valorized by the rest of society and should be seen by you. What you therefore do is detract from arguments against, for instance, saying we should maybe rehabilitate these people because they are all worthy of being able to change and deserve that as a platform to do so. But I think that there's a final argument here that's super relevant, and that is to say that in cases where capital punishment is really popular, it's often in states that are fighting against things like fundamentalist terrorism or separatist groups. Oftentimes, this is the case where you create the elements of martyrdom, i.e. recognize that deterrence often doesn't work because the criminals who engage in, criminals don't really think about getting caught, so that the fear of capital punishment is usually not enough to deter you, but secondarily, crimes of passion or sociopathy often mean they don't care and cannot predict that they're going to face that crime. What do you do in that instance? You turn this person, especially if they come from a background that's, for instance, say a fundamentalist, separatist group, or a fundamentalist religious group, you often give their followers a means of marginalizing that individual, i.e. they now see that person as a further instrumentalized body used by a violent state against your group that's now being televised to everyone. What this means is that not only are you more likely to increase the instances of violence from the group that they belong to, but secondarily, fence sitters or those who are ideologically sympathizing with those fundamentalist groups now see this as a way of the state levying that terror and violence against them, and you further increase the narrative that the fundamentalist group that's engaging in violent action is one that should be sympathized with and one that should be joined in a fight against an unjust state. In both instances, you increase violence, you increase trauma, and you do not prove to me that this is the means through which you gain change. People are not social battering rams. Vote side opposition.
I thank that speaker very much for those remarks. I ask the deputy leader of the opposition to put on a mask. That's you, Sreyan.
I think I left it somewhere. Can I get that next room? Very intense debate.
That being said, this House is now very pleased to welcome the Deputy Prime Minister. Hear, hear.
All right, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. All right, so I'm going to start my speech with 4 points of rebuttal, then go into building up my partner's points and explaining why we didn't wait. So first point of rebuttal, which is a combination point. I see two things coming out of opening opposition. One, that people won't watch this or don't want to watch this, and somehow millions of people are going to be traumatized. You have to pick a side. Either it is people are going to be watching this, they're going to be traumatized, or they won't be watching it, and they won't be traumatized. And in your world, no one is watching this. So that doesn't, because it's not televised. So to your point that people don't want to watch this, at least in our world, they have a opportunity, an ability, a chance to watch it if it is something they want to. And even if most people don't, some people will. If you've seen how social media spreads, those people who are willing to watch it will still be able to take that, put put it on social media, put it on their platforms, put it on those places and say, hey, look, this is what's happening. Then people who aren't watching it directly can still be engaged with it. And they don't have to watch execution videos directly. They can still get it from those secondary sources. We can't get that right now because there is no televisation, and the amount of people who are able to see executions is incredibly, incredibly minimal. That's why there isn't a lot of discussion about that kind of thing. Moving on to the glorifying violence point, we already have plenty of violence glorified in this country. Look anywhere, look on any news site, look on any video game. There's a ton of violence in this country. We already have videos of POC being killed by another government identity, the cops, and people still support and protest for Black Lives Matter. We don't think that that looks like desensitization. The point about it's unnecessary to do this. People still support capital punishment, and according to their thing that we want to think capital punishment is bad. If people are still actively supporting capital punishment, then we think that this is a way to bring more light to it, a way to actually lower capital punishment. And by that point, it is necessary because there are people who still think that capital punishment is a valid way of punishing people in our society. And lastly, they didn't talk a lot about this, but their point about keeping communities contained and servile. Didn't hear a lot about this, but I know a little bit about it from history, like being forced to watch executions. That was usually a system when people didn't have a lot of say in their government. We live in a democracy, and it's not great, but it does allow people to feel invigorated towards a cause rather than feel helpless. When you are watching an execution and say, hey, maybe that's going to come up on the ballot next year, and I can vote against it because I think that this is horrible, we think that you are invigorated to stop that instead of being or scared. Moving on to building up our points. So my partner brought you 3 points. One, the idea that capital punishment is currently being hidden and sanitized, and this would bring it out into the open. Secondly, that people have a right to know what executions look like and what their government does. And third, that this would likely lower executions, which would be a net positive, as we've agreed across the board on both opening sides, that capital punishment is bad. So going back to that first point, right now we live in a society that wants to hide and sanitize, or a government that wants to hide and sanitize the worst parts of what they do. Things like prison conditions that are subjected to very little oversight and often perpetuate awful abuses, not right now, because they can do this because they exist on the fringes of society where people don't have a lot of access to. People don't know what prisons look like, and this extends to capital punishment as well. Very few people know what capital punishment looks like, whether they're for it or against it. They don't know what it looks like. This would allow people to watch people's last moments. And this is really dark. I'm very apologizing, but they can see that people are like us. They're breathing. They're crying. They can see them stop breathing. They can see all kinds of terrible things that capital punishment does, because capital punishment, as much as we like to sanitize it and make it look painless, is not. People who have watched it have seen people convulse from lethal injections or from the electric chair, and that's awful. And I don't think that's something that people have to contend with right now, because most of our population doesn't ever get a chance to see that. So they don't have to think about it. They don't have to contend with it. And the government is allowed to do with it because there is no personal oversight from their citizens, which leading into our second point. People have the right to knowledge of what those execution looks like so that they can be aware and involved in what their government does. Right now, people, like I just said, live in relative ignorance of what capital punishment looks like. It doesn't matter if you support it. You should be able to see what it looks like. And that way you actually have a more full and control idea when you say that you're for it or against it. You're not saying that from oh, this is a fun political thing for me to debate, but actually having seen or heard about other people who have seen what it actually looks like for the government to take someone else's life. I'll take back half if you have one, otherwise I'll take front half. Back half? Front half.
If I support capital punishment, I'm probably okay with watching people die. If I don't support it, I'm further traumatized and you lose out the impact there. Also, the incentive to sanitize exists if it's public, not if it's private.
All right, move to your first point about that if you already support capital punishment, you're not going to care if you see it. I actually don't think that that's true. I think that a lot of people do support capital punishment because they don't know what it looks like and are able to just be it's, getting rid of bad people, and I don't have to think about it. Once you actually have to look at it and think about it and watch it in detail, I think a lot of people who do support capital punishment would do a 180 and not support it anymore. But there are also people who are more moderate, and there are people who are maybe against it but not super actively. But by having this come to the forefront, to have it be televised, I think that would change all of those people to a more adamant voting kind of way of being against capital punishment in a much stronger way, because they could actually see what it's like. Third point, why this would likely lower executions, which would be a net positive, again, because both sides have said that, capital punishment is bad. I personally think capital punishment is wrong. But even if you agree with capital punishment in principle, in practice, we still hover around a 5% of error. So 5% of people who are executed by the government were executed wrongly due to things like DNA exonerations. We know that number exists. So either you think capital punishment is bad and you are lowering the amount of people that the government kills, but even if you are okay with that, there is still a percentage of error that we have accepted for that, and that is being lowered, which means that we are necessarily lowering the people who are unjustly killed by the government in terms of executions, which I think is also a net positive. Why would it lower the amount of executions? Because we just stated that. Two reasons. One, as Charles already said, the government would be forced to show executions, so prosecutors and judges and people who work for the government would be less likely to attempt to get capital punishment in trial proceedings. Because if they're like, hey, we have to show the worst thing we ever do that we know that people probably aren't going to be like super in support of, which is probably why executions aren't televised now, then they're going to be less likely to pursue that as a punishment. And secondly, as I already said in response to POI, people are going to be more likely to vote against it when it comes up on ballot measures, to argue against it, because they are more likely seeing the human side of it. So the impacts we bring to you are a more transparent and accountable government and a more aware society, both of which are net positives on their own. I think that even if you wipe out our third point, those are both net positives. But also that these factors combined would lower executions. The people, as the report stated, the people who are executed are mostly most vulnerable populations, people of color majorly, and so that would be lowering the overall number of them. We are lowering the number of people of color who are killed by our government. And POC communities are already being killed in mass by police. This doesn't change a substantial trauma that opening tried to tell you it does, because that's already existing, seeing their communities get killed. At this point, at least you're lowering the numbers and maybe having more outcry against it in a way that we haven't seen before. So why is our world better than the alternative, i.e. the status quo? In our current world, we're either passively or actively supporting the government-sponsored killing of our own citizens. In our world, we are having at least awareness and understanding on both the government and the citizens' part, which we hopefully would lead to a lower amount of people being okay with this and a lower amount of people being killed by the government overall. So proud to propose. Thank you.
I thank that speaker very much for those remarks. This House is now pleased to welcome the Deputy Leader of the Opposition. Hear, hear.
I think both sides agree that capital punishments is one of the most shameful things we need to do as a society. We execute a life because we essentially failed them by creating an environment that misjudges them, or in some cases where if it's artificially justice, we created an environment where we let evil forces infect their mind. But by the time you see someone hang with a rope around their neck and taking their last breath, and seeing them crying on TV, we've already lost them. You're not saving anyone anymore, because that life is lost. So showing someone that last moment is not going to change anything. It's not going to bring back a life. It's not going to make BLM protesters that scream on the streets think that, our police is worse. What it's going to do is going to create this society where a polarized bunch of people think that this is justice, and another polarized people who already believe that this was injustice still believes it to be true, but is now a bit more traumatized thanks to it being on TV. That panel is the end-all be-all of this debate. I'm first going to talk about OG's major contribution, which is that there is some magical demographic that hate capital punishment, but only needs to see it to realize it, right? The two responses here is, one, that logic is a bit bad. If you already are, nobody is that clueless that they're oblivious to the fact that a loss of life is a bad thing. But two, I think there are alternative ways to educate the heinousness of it. The fact that principally killing someone is just bad. You can do a lot of investigative journalism about it. You can read a lot of articles about it. You take classes about criminal justice reform. But even if all of that is inaccessible to you, the fact if you've ever seen a family member die and you've seen how bad that feels, you would think that going away is just a very painful experience for everyone around you, including yourself. So I just don't think, panel, people need to be educated about the fact that death is bad, especially death is bad for people who are innocent. But then they say that we need oversight. We need to make sure the BLM movement is stronger, and showing the viscerality of death is going to be the tipping point of change. The issue with that panel is that they themselves concede that the people who are most empathetic, the people who are most well-educated and are likely to take the streets, are already going to be extremely traumatized and not going to see it. So I'm going to answer the question that OG didn't. who's going to actually watch it? It's going to be people who genuinely, by that point, believe that these are criminals. Which means that it's going to be a polarized sect of individuals that feel like their death is going to make society safer. Because that's what you would want to see. Like, we watch TV or we watch something for either entertainment or edification, right? If that is the case, you're likely to watch this only to feel better about society improving. Because nobody like flips through the screen and let's see what makes me feel bad about myself. You only turn on the TV because you want to see something that makes you feel objectively better. And if that is true, panel, those people are beyond empathy because the polarization has already got to them. If all of this is true, panel, the only thing that, if I'm being very charitable to OG, that you are achieving is some discourse about capital punishment. Whether this discourse is good or bad, I don't know. But here's the thing, panel. The discourse about capital punishment for all of these years, just FYI, capital punishment has decreased substantially all across the world. But assuming it's not enough, assuming we need to abolish capital punishment from the face of the earth, I still don't understand why it must come at the cost of trauma. Because they haven't told you why we can't tell better stories, why we can't write more informative articles, why we can't have more public speakers talk about it, more politicians talk about it, why all of these things suddenly just don't work, given that it has worked so much times in the past. For all of these reasons, I think OG is clearly out. I'll take CG.
So how is there any way that the sick subset of individuals you're describing that watch and enjoy or approve of a public execution are going to change their mind in any way in this debate? So how is there any outstanding harm for them when this is televised? Like, what is the delta there?
So the delta, panel, I think Sarim explained to you in twofold. One, Sarim told you it's injurious to emotions of the public. Because here's the thing. We don't live in the 1950s anymore. So things just don't stream on TV. When you normalize the fact that something is okay to be nationally publicized, it makes it through your Facebook, it makes it through your Instagram, Snapchat feed, etc. What does that mean, panel? Even if you can escape your TV, you're likely to see some people saying, yay, look at the criminal being like, given their justice, or some people going like, look at what heinous thing has happened, right? That's their OG's best case. Even in that world, panel, even if you're someone who's undecided about whether this person is good or bad, just think about how horrible it feels. We cried when Iron Man died in Avengers Endgame. All right? So if you are someone who's extremely empathetic to that individual and actually feel that individual's pain, you're going to be traumatized for life. But if you're also someone who thinks that this individual is objectively bad, you're going to feel like we should have more capital punishment because you think that is how society is going to objectively be safer. So the net harm is the people that would advocate for capital punishment to be reduced has more trauma under your world, and the people who think capital punishment is a good way to dish out justice is going to be more exacerbated because the adrenaline rush of seeing a criminal die is amazing to them. So at the end of the day, panel, how do you tilt this debate to OO's side? Because at the end of the day, we told you that people's emotions ought not to be treated as social battering ram for change. We are already emotionally exhausted by the fact that people are being incarcerated every single day. You're not giving us jail TV, right? You're not showing us how people are being mistreated in jail. You're only showing us what happens when the worst of scenarios happen. Which means, panel, at the end of the day, the change that you're trying to bring is utilizing people's emotions in the short run and traumatizing them. But even if that is okay by you, even if you think we should instrumentalize people, in the long run, we are animals who get normalized to our environment. Which means at one point, maybe 10 years, maybe 20 years in time, we're not going to care when we see someone hang to their death. Thank you.
I thank that speaker very much for those remarks. This House is now pleased to recognize the member of government.
Okay, can everyone hear me like this? Yep, okay. I think a lot of the mess in this debate so far is that it's very unclear whether or not the public is going to watch this. The way Closing Government is going to enter this debate is by explaining how the main stakeholder that matters is not the public that watches this, but rather political action groups that now uniquely have access to information and footage that can allow them to get a lot more change for execution and criminal justice reform. This is going to be unique from opening government because a lot of their stuff is just, ooh, generally people see this and that's good. And that becomes messy against opening opposition. We say political action groups are unique because of their ability to use the information strategically, and that's going to be our extension. What do we think this debate looks like most likely, right? I think probably the first time this is televised, you're going to have a lot of people watching this and it's going to be hype. But then I think immediately after that, what happens is that people realize this is disgusting. People see this as something that's extremely gory, and a lot of people don't watch. What does this mean? One, opening opposition is out of this debate because most of their impacts are based on people watching this continuously and buying into this. I think the problem with that is now you don't have these people watching it, so a lot of their impacts don't happen. But I think the people who are going to watch this are people who uniquely care about conditions for these prisoners and people who are on death row. So people who care about creating reform in the system, people who care about conditions for executions, and I think political action groups are the ones that are going to do this. I think opening government asserts like specific public reactions as well, right? Like they say like people are going to react positively, and opening opposition says people are going to react negatively. This is unclear, but I think what we can guarantee is that action groups that are designed specifically to protect criminals and to make sure that their rights are reflected in society and laws are probably likely to care about these people and are going to act in the ways that we are going to talk about. We're also going to fill in a lot of the facts for why TV specifically is the kind of evidence that you want to get this change. So first, why does visualization uniquely get more empathetic or humane execution methods, and why do we get better change on our side? I think the first thing to note is that opening government misses the comparative. Right now, the way executions work is that they're extremely private. That means it looks like things like we're having like a small room of a few people, a couple officers, the family of the person who's getting executed, and the family of the victim. And you don't have like records or publishing a lot of the data from these trials, right? So maybe the public gets access to the information that this person was killed and maybe like the day they were killed, but you don't know necessarily like what specific method of execution was used, or how this person died, or how much they suffered, what kind of pain they went through, etc. I think what uniquely changes then is through this medium. What do we get? Few things. One, I think now you get a very obvious form of information that is unique to our side. Now you have like unique knowledge on our side through like TV, which is a visible medium where you can see this person in pain. I think it's like very hard on their side to do this through things like statistics or like trying to explain like the chemicals that are used in like a news story or like a scientific report. And I think a lot of people just aren't going to be interested in reading this. But comparatively, if a political action group shows you something like someone like suffering or like screaming, that is going to be a lot more compelling to the average person when the information is used in this strategic matter for a political cause than if you just have access to things like statistics. So I think the way in which this is presented is more strategic for these groups and more conducive to getting change. The second thing is the build-up and the press discourse surrounding this. So I think now you already have quite a bit of press surrounding like the case and the trial. A lot of the times when you have high-profile cases, that often lead to people going to death row. I think now when you have the execution televised as well, and film and like CNN and like journalists have access to information about the execution as well, this is an additional part that's going to receive even more press coverage. So maybe it's not the case that people watch like the execution itself, but they watch the coverage, right? They're likely to watch the analysis and learn about what happened because they don't want to see the gory things exactly. So what this means is like you get more information out there about the methods used or like the reaction of the person through this press discourse. And this is also a medium in which political action communities can go on and talk about like, you can have like discussions with people from these groups in these like journal settings, in these like media settings, and explain why this is such a horrible thing, why this is something that should be stopped. And you can advocate for people in this medium. This is unique to our side because in their world where you don't televise this, you don't have journalists having the ability to talk about these things. You don't have things like footage, for example. You don't have things like interviews from people like after the execution because it's not public, and you don't have the ability to do this on their side. Yeah, I'll take 00.
things are beautified for TV all the time doesn't mean that it's structural change. But if it is beautified and people feel better about people dying, how is that a good thing?
No. So the only way you can make like death better is by making it less painful. That's the biggest impact on our side. I think the only way you can like beautify it is by making the execution methods more humane, so the person doesn't feel pain and so they don't die like horribly because of the fact that it's televised. The third thing, and the reason why visualization is so important, is the empathetic visualization, right? Like the stuff that OG talks about when they say like, oh, you know, when you see someone on TV, the reason why you care isn't just because you see it, but it's because you can connect with this person on a human level. Like this is something that's very different than when you're reading statistics in a paper or when you're like reading a news report. You see this person, you see that they're human, and you have a greater ability to empathize with them. And this doesn't just mean like normal people watching this. We mean that like when political action groups can use this information, it's a lot more useful. So what happens then when these specific groups have access to this information and they can disseminate it in a strategic way? I think one, you have just a much clearer evidence of like things like pain and evidence of like the horrors that happen when this is public and when it's televised. So you can keep the footage for yourself, you can clip it, you can use it in a strategic way. I think the kinds of impacts that we get are a few things. One, I think you can have very effective use of this footage. So you don't have to use it in the way that like Top Half talks about, which is like normal people watching it with like their family or their kids. You can use it effectively like in certain political ads, for example, like you use certain clips and you can show how this is so horrible. You can take like certain bits and put it into context and show how, and add like statistics and add like things on top of this footage in ads to support your cause. I think you can use this in a strategic way to show how this is such a horrible thing and add value to the other forms of information that you have in order to get better change for prisoners. The second thing is that you can just see the pattern of racism, right? Like if you have 1,000 clips of like executions and like 900 of them are black men, it becomes a lot easier for people to say like, okay, we're probably racist in the way that we do things and to get change. I think that's like a very obvious thing that OG missed. The third thing is that the government is also likely to preempt this because they don't want to deal with a lot of these action groups and they don't want to deal with the backlash. So in some degree, they're going to preemptively respond and they're not going to be as harsh. Very proud to propose.
We thank that speaker for those remarks. This House is now pleased to welcome the member of the opposition.
Mic check. Is the audio good? Am I at an adequate distance and audible? I'm going to start a timer for myself, and then I'll begin. I will try to take POIs throughout the speech, and my time begins in 3, 2, 1. Now, we have all asserted in this debate to some degree, and largely a magnanimous degree, that the death penalty is a terrible thing, right? But the reasons why we're going to contend that it is bad on closing opposition and how we fix the fact that we have far too many people, if the general bulk of people being executed, right, regardless of our moral stances on the death penalty, we contend with the fact that far too many people are being executed in this society at a very minimum, regardless of the fact that the death penalty exists. Now, getting into our argumentation today, we'd like to take a moment and reflect upon what happens when somebody is brought under the violent brunt of the state and executed, right? The end of their story may be their last breath, the last beat of their heart, but the truth is, this is a far, far longer tale and trail of failures, endemic, societal, personal, on multiple levels, right? And the reason why closing opposition today is going to win this debate is we're going to really, really bring in the criminal justice system in its entirety as a stakeholder today, and we're going to explain how, regardless of if we can galvanize activism and get political capital to overrule the death penalty, regardless of how effective the arguments about kind of pitting political capital against visceral horror or appeal or polarization are, that we have a mechanism, a solvency mechanism, for how we can develop restorative justice in our society today that, while we would like to severely kneecap the death penalty, even at worst case, we can still claim, regardless of how intracted it may be in some areas. Now, this debate so far has been contextualized by a clash over, in a sense, how can we resonate with the most people, right? We have this idea of political capital coming off of GovBench. We have generalized political capital from the opening team and kind of a more specific political capital that is co-opted by and used by these activist groups on the back half, right? And then that kind of gets brought in confluence with these arguments made by opposition about polarization, echo chambers, and the fact that, quite frankly, there are two types of people in this world: the people who will turn on the execution on television and the people who won't, right? At a bare minimum. And how much relative involvement we get with that on the margins is dynamic, and there's contention over that. But we're going to make a point that even outside of that context stands alone, and inside of that context is very, very dynamic, right? So thinking back to Michel Foucault and the fact that historically speaking, executions used to be a part of the public sphere, right? We used to showcase the brutality of the state at the gallows and at the guillotine. We used to take our mentally ill and incapacitated and place them into stockades. Now, the violence of the state has largely transitioned into private spaces, right? We go from executions being in public to executions being in private. And the reality of that is, and Foucault argues that it's this superficial surface level of velvet glove on an iron fist. We're going to contend here today that even if it's still just a velvet glove, the very existence of that velvet glove is enough to provide solvency for the criminal justice system as a whole, which is an actor that really hasn't been talked about, right? We talk about the public perceptions of the criminal justice system, but not the systems and the structures in and of itself. So we're in a sense going to talk about how maintaining status quo, at least in the majority of the world, and by not showing these executions on television, is going to translate into potentially more mechanisms for restorative justice and long-term change, right? Yes, I'll take your POI.
Speaker, you still haven't engaged on our case how capital punishment is hidden and sanitized, on how government can sort of work behind the scenes, and how our side of the house allows for social justice movements to gain ammunition, incentivizes criminal justice system to be more accountable. Please engage, Speaker.
Yes, so your argument is largely washed out by the work that opening opposition has done, right? We have this contention in here over who sees the material, polarized echo chambers versus the kind of impacts of the body politique, and we believe that it's largely a wash, right? Even if you're able to galvanize a few more percent of the population to vote in favor of repealing the death penalty, may that be enough? Yes, may that not be enough, but it depends on the jurisdiction, right? It's kind of this relativized localistic mechanism. What we're going to contend, right, is that the very, very nature of this motion, showcasing the state executing people on television, regardless of how humane or inhumane the execution seems, and we contend that the execution is innately inhumane, that that very, very act puts the state and puts the entire criminal justice system, which is a hell of a lot more than just killing people. It incarcerates them, it puts them on probation, it has a magnanimous role in our society that impacts far more stakeholders than just those on death row. When we characterize it as being largely punitive, right? And that's what we're doing, because the public conception of this, regardless of if you see the executions on TV or not, having televised executions by the state, by the federal government, wherever this is, showcases that they are putting that as the front of this system, right? That's an innately punitive system, and it ingratiates and spells the fact that this is a heavily punitive process, right? We're going to talk about restorative justice and how we can kind of achieve that on our side of the house today, right? So first of all, it's a very, very simple proposition, right? But if you don't have the criminal justice system executing people on television, regardless of who's viewing it or who's covering it, right, we are hiding things away. And that is, in a sense, a lie and a harm that we're going to bite, right? Because at the end of the day, at face value, the difference here is between a system in a state that executes people on television and one that doesn't, right? And if we change those conceptions, what we're really allowed to do is we're allowed to rework how we conceptualize what justice looks like, right? So regardless of who's buying into this for the punitive aspects or for the not, or to be moved into view this political capital, right? We contend that by portraying, even if it is a lie, a good lie, by portraying the justice system in this way, we are enabled to get more public investment, more active stakeholders, more gubernatorial investment in not necessarily feeling the need or the burning desire to fundamentally alter or tear down the system, but rather how we can make it more humane and more receptive. Even if it's still the iron fist buried in the velvet glove, right, we can get more pragmatic and more tangible impacts, right? If we view this process as a whole as not being innately punitive and glorifying state power, if we can change that conception, or if we have that conception not exist in the first place, what we're fundamentally allowed and enabled to do is to work on advocating and developing for restorative justice, right? So this whole idea that we can work on prevention, work on investment in schools, work on investment in education, and I know those are a bunch of generic points here, but the whole point is that if we don't have the same mainline obsequious focus on the state executing people, we can instead work on how these people ended up on the execution block in the first place, regardless of if this was just or unjust, regardless of if this is on TV or not on TV, and we can fundamentally begin to focus on and reconcile with the structural factors that have put people in the place to be at the brunt of state violence. Thank you for your time. Proud to oppose.
I thank that speaker for those remarks, and this House now recognizes the government whip.
Okay. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Without trying to be rude, I genuinely don't understand what closing opposition's case is. Now, I think generally the idea is that in the status quo, if we just don't do anything, then somehow we will get restorative justice or something like that. Politics is a game where you have to make people feel uncomfortable and push them to do things in order to create action, in order to create change. Closing opposition fundamentally misunderstands that, stands for I don't even know what version of the status quo, and I don't know how they're accessing any change in this debate. It almost sounded like they were arguing for our side, so I'm genuinely confused. Maybe I'll get back to them later. I want to just get on to the general point in this debate, which is I think what Top Half didn't get right is who is watching these actual executions. Now, since I've known Amar, I've caught him watching some odd TV channels. He watches Gossip Girl, some National Geography, and stuff like that, National Geographic. But if I walked in on this guy watching a public execution, the last word in my mind would be normal. And that's what opening opposition genuinely thinks people are going to accept, like, and approve of. Opening opposition just doesn't know how people actually would react to somebody actually being executed, which is, it's not a good feeling to see someone die, even if you support, like, the idea of the death penalty. But here's the issue, right? Is opening opposition's namesake in this debate, and the way that they're supposedly going to win this debate is by saying millions of people will watch this and be traumatized. First of all, millions of people aren't going to tune in, like, when they get home from work and, like, flip through the channels and be like, let me watch, like, this person getting executed. That's sick. That doesn't happen. That's not reality. I don't know, like, it's not going to become the ball game like they think it's going to on opening opposition. Let me be very clear. Amar was the first person in this debate to tell you who actually watches this, who cares, who has a stake in seeing what's going to be put on TV. And it's not going to be the initial airing on television. Nobody watches C-SPAN, and it's normalized like any, like, person in this room watches C-SPAN in their free time. That's ridiculous. The actual place where this change happens is through third-party information markets, third-party circulation of the actual content. The specific stakeholders that are important here are political action groups, and the way in which government is going to self-regulate because of the fact that it knows it can be weaponized and will be seen by the public. These two mechanisms are incredibly important, and I'm going to use them in comparison to opening government, because I think it's very key. But before I do that, I'll get on to OO, but I'll give them a chance to say something. Go ahead.
The only way for political action groups to get traction is to, get this, show the public. We tell you that increasing trauma, exhaustion, and desensitization isn't worth it, insofar as you don't prove to me a tipping point for why this is the reason you get change against capital punishment.
Okay, so here's a tipping point, right? You see someone getting hung, then political action groups have footage of someone getting hung. Now when they go to the politician who is for, like, the death penalty, and they're like, oh, well, we do a humane thing where we inject people and they don't feel any pain, and they show them, like, a video of someone getting hung, or they show a video of them obviously in pain from an injection, that is undeniable truth. That's evidence that exists only on our side. That is a way that you create change, and it doesn't mandate that you show millions of people and change their minds about the death penalty. Let's get real for a second. Opening government's mechanism is is, it sounds nice. I would love to live in a world in which open government is right. But the last time I voted, do any of you remember the death penalty being on the ballot? How does that make a difference in our elections at all? Here are the two mechanisms that actually matter. One, government self-regulation, which Amar gives to you, right? Which is the idea that these state-like agencies that run executions in the criminal justice system will self-regulate because they know if they put like someone being hung on TV, that's bad optics. And like they don't even care what the actual reality of like backlash would be on them. It's just the potential for that backlash to exist that is an important mech. Here's the second thing. You sit down the person who is literally like the politician, the state regulator, who is in charge of like the decisions that are made about these executions, and you show him exactly what his department is doing. That changes people's minds. Those are the right people, and those are the people that are actually going to matter in this debate. I'll give CO a POI because I'd love to engage with you, but I'll take OO again. Go ahead.
So why not just allow CNN to access this footage? Why nationally televise it first? Because all your impacts rest on journalists getting it, right?
What? So you'd rather them experience the trauma on CNN? What is your point here? Like your whole case was that you want to prevent people from being traumatized, right? And now you're telling me, oh well, can't we just have it on CNN instead and give them an exclusive? Like what case is that? I don't understand it. Let's like kick out opening opposition's ridiculous case out of the debate though before I move on to comparing to OG. Right. So opening opposition's whole like case is that this is adding trauma by televising it. Well, you know what? The right people feeling uncomfortable, disgusted, and sick, like after seeing content from an execution, is not only worth creating change, but it's the point. Like that is not trauma, and you're going to label it trauma, and all trauma is the same, and then that's like a net bad in this debate. That is the point, and that's how you motivate people to actually change their position on something. That's how you get people to react and say, this is disgusting, and then the politician can't stand behind that, and like will try to make change when they can, or at least like is more motivated to when they see another human being and are able to visualize and empathize with a person that is being injected and killed. This is the way in which you actually create change, and it's also the way in which you force government to preempt change and change the way that they do executions, because before they just wrote it in a letter, like maybe to the press or maybe to whoever they have to notify that they killed someone the other day. They used to write, well, like John Smith was hung the other day. Like that doesn't evoke the same kind of reaction that actually it being filmed does. And it's not just about how the public is going to receive this, it's how the government thinks that they might receive this and thinks that they might hold them accountable for this. The weighing, I think, is very clear. We are okay with whoever is going to like voluntarily tune into this sick channel of being like if you're at your own risk. Like, you know, like if you go to like the Optimum Guide and you see executions from 7 p.m. on, like you clicked on that, you went there, right? We are fine with those people feeling uncomfortable if it means that we now have footage that can be given to people like CNN, given to organizations like political action committees that want to change to more humane methods of execution, of getting the ammunition and the undeniable proof that they need to show that actual abuses are taking place and that they need to change. These are the mechanisms through which you create change. The idea that when OG says that, well, maybe not everyone will watch, but at least more people on our side will watch as compared to yours, that's not sufficient. What is sufficient is getting government to try to preempt and try to damage control before you even get this on the ballot. That's the real way politics is played, and that's how we win. Very proud to stand for CG.
I thank that speaker for those remarks, and this House now recognizes the final speaker of the debate, the opposition whip. Hear, hear.
Okay. Are we good? Yep. All right. Okay, starting speech in 3, 2, 1. So what we hear so far from this debate is really a characterization of the death penalty as humanizing criminals. And that creates a variation of certain impacts, either on gov side or on op side. And really what my partner brings you is that's just not the case. That we on CG characterize televising executions as an exhibition of punitive justice, and that leverage of state power is inherently enough to remove this aspect of humanization. That even when we get, actually really, let's discuss the characterization of the death penalty real quick. So what we hear from both Gov and Opside is that the death penalty is carried out in a very personal way, where what we're seeing is the criminal at their last moments, and we're really close right next to them. And in practice, that's really not how many death penalties are carried out. That the state is very, very good at making sure that it looks like an act of state power. We see this all over in many authoritarian communities and many authoritarian governments, and everywhere in the world that televises public executions is not making them this very human, very personal, intimate experience. It's an act of state power. It's a show of punitive justice. This is what happens when you cross us. And so what we're saying is that that is really the problem here, is that the fact that the state is involved here, and that we're watching state-sponsored murder. We can't see why that is somehow good for anybody, and why on either side we get this humanization. I'll take the POI.
So CG tries to steal our point, but from OG, we tell you how, by airing the George Floyd death on TV and social media, you gave the Black Lives Matter ammunition. We tell you how, in the same vein, you give social justice movements ammunition and force accountability on the criminal justice system. Please engage, Speaker.
Yeah, okay, so we understand, and you present a powerful argument that, this televisation, this giving of information will create change. However, what we would say is that that doesn't, first of all, that doesn't outweigh the cost of state power being in play here. And second of all, the fact that this is not actually how it would probably happen. That why in the world would a government intentionally, expose themselves in this way? And so what we say is that first of all, we introduced the criminal justice system in general as a primary stakeholder in this debate. What my partner gives you is that basically the velvet glove on the iron fist is a framing of criminal justice as primarily rehabilitative rather than punitive. And so really what we're asking here, what my partner tells you, is what makes rehabilitative justice better, right? We say is that rehabilitative justice introduces a kinder face of justice for society. That it is, first of all, for criminal, it's better for all criminals because society looks at them with more compassion. Here, again, Gov has said that televising deaths will do this, but we hear from Op also that this really just introduces more harm than it actually helps. And then what we also say is that by hiding away the death penalty, we're reframing how justice is characterized. And so, and really that is our primary contribution to this debate. I'll take the POI from CG.
Yeah, so I think what your case is talking about is the execution of political prisoners in countries that don't even have the democratic means for change that the entire Gov bench is talking about. How is that relevant? And also, why is executing a serial killer in Florida going to hurt democracy?
Okay, let's imagine that for a second that the death penalty actually works the way that we say it is, right? That you say it is, right? Where we're looking at a very personal experience of somebody who committed murder and is for some reason regretting this, and that everybody or that political groups are looking at these are showing off this very humanized serial killer in front of everybody. Where are we going to? How does that create more change than focusing on rehabilitative justice in general and changing the political dynamic from, instead of saying, look at, this punitive justice is bad, then saying rehabilitative justice is good, right? So that is, and we, honestly, this is my partner said, we think that just takes you out of the debate here. And so when we say, by focusing on rehabilitative justice, we get greater impacts for society as a whole, right? And so, again, what that means is that means we're opening a dialogue not about murder and killing, but about rehab for drug addicts who are about reducing the prison population and things like that. I'll take the BOI before time.
Yeah, on that. So you're arguing for the status quo where we don't show executions on TV. Where do we see all of those benefits in the status quo? Because I don't see them.
Exactly. Well, I mean, right now what we're seeing is that again, the focus on rehabilitative justice. Where in the in our we're fighting we're fighting against the war on drugs, right? Where we saw a very punitive system, and after that, we realized, oh, this is actually bad, and there are too many people in jail. And how do we reform prisons? How do we reform police? That in itself is a focus on rehabilitative justice. That is what we're arguing for. That this is actually a good dialogue to be had. What we're doing right now, as opposed to opening up a new dialogue about the death penalty. And so, in weighing this debate, what's really important here is sort of what impacts that everyone creates and where we see those, right? So we say, so OG says that the people that support capital punishment, like, are that televising executions humanizes criminals and sort of opens a dialogue about the criminal justice system. We would say that on our side, we get more of those impacts because that's already happening, and we don't need this very graphic imagery, and it opens the wrong dialogue, again, because it's on a punitive focus as opposed to rehabilitative. And then we get from OO that televised executions sort of create harms to society through the desensitization of murder, and we completely agree with that, but we say that we get better harms from that. Anyway, very, very proud to oppose. Thank you.
No, you did a good job. I don't have time. I got a few minutes at the end.
I need you to say.
Thank you very much. Please give one more round of applause to all the debaters.